Good evening. In a socially distanced world, Design United is an optimistic digital platform for collaborative design and connection. In a socially distanced world, Design United is an optimistic digital platform for collaborative design and connection. Design United was created in March 2020 during a period of intense lockdown and quarantine measures within the region. The aim behind Design United was to create an optimistic space for regional dialogue, connections, collaborations, and opportunities for young regional designers and design practices. A much needed network of support and peer mentorship during these uncertain times. Talented young designers and design studios working on design innovation with an approach that is relevant to our South Asian region have been invited to be a part of the platform. We also encourage design students from the region to share their work, be involved in the dialogue, and to be an active part of Design United. Design United, most of all, believes in creating a community of designers and design knowledge that is largely contextual, with focus on contributing to the environment and our community. Design United believes greatly in a spirit of collaboration and idea exchange. Welcome to Design United's 21st Design Conversation with two talented designers and recent graduates from the MDes program at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design. Angela Mayrina from Jakarta, Indonesia, and Karan Saharya from New Delhi, India. I'm Varna Shashidhar, founder principal of a regional landscape practice VSLA based in Bengaluru. I'm supported by Clayworks Spaces in this endeavor. Clayworks creates flexible co-work spaces that focus on productivity and sustainability. They have a new product that is a complete work-from-home solution, Spotch. I'm also supported by my very enthusiastic Design United team, comprising of young designers and design students from South Asian region. The aim behind Design United is to create an optimistic space for regional dialogue, connections, collaborations, and opportunities for young designers and design practices, a network of support and mentorship during these uncertain times. In the past, we have had talented emerging designers join us from around the subcontinent and the South Asian region. We are delighted today to welcome our presenting designers, Karan Saharya, and Angela Mayrina into Design Conversation. Karan Saharya, our very first presenter, is a young architect from New Delhi. He has an undergraduate degree from Delhi. He has practiced as an architect and an urban designer in both New Delhi and Florence. He recently graduated from the MDes program with a focus on critical conservation and urban studies from Harvard GSD, with a number of awards: the Gerald McHugh Medal for attaining the highest overall academic record, the Design Studies Thesis Prize. He has also won grants from South Asia Institute and the Joint Center for Housing Studies. He is currently working as a curator with a cultural organization in New York. His research lies at the intersection of urban planning, architectural conservation, and cultural anthropology. His presentation today is titled "In the Name of Heritage: Conservation as an Agent of Elite Development, Spatial Cleansing, and Social Exclusion in Mehrauli, New Delhi." Our second presenting designer is Angela Mayrina. Angela is a designer from Jakarta, Indonesia. She graduated with honors from Pratt Institute's BFA program in interior design with a minor in psychology. Grounded in her Indonesian cultural heritage with an interest in art, history, and design, Angela graduated with a master's in design studies in the art, design, and the public domain MDes program from Harvard GST this year. Her practice explores ways in which design can communicate and elicit questions through a constant interplay between boundaries that redefines common assumptions. Her title for today's presentation is A Guidebook to an Empty Land, Kalimantan and the Shadows of the Capital City, which won the GST's MDes Thesis Prize for 2020. Congratulations to both our speakers, and we are so happy to welcome Karan and Angela to Design Conversation. Requesting Karan to share his work with us, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Varna. Thank you to all the fellow panelists. Hi, Angela, and Design United, the whole team, for inviting me today. I'm very excited to be doing this. So, good evening. Happy Saturday, and welcome to New Delhi. So, if you ever happen to be in this dynamic city of 20 million people, you would probably hear about its 1,000-year-old history. Lifestyle blogs would tell you to visit its many monuments, including this one, the Qutub Minar, which is also a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It was built in the 12th century by the first Muslim ruler of India as a triumphal minaret within a mosque complex. It is unique in its architecture with Persian, Arabic, Afghan, Nagri elements. It is one of the oldest examples of what is often referred to as the Indo-Islamic style. It's a curious name, and I'll get to it in just a bit. Today, the Qutub Minar is the symbol of tourism in Delhi, comparable only perhaps to the Taj Mahal in North India. 3 million tourists in 2018 alone, bringing in crores of rupees to the exchequer. Perhaps you would Instagram this building and then stop for a cocktail at a bar nearby. Maybe even play a round of golf. And one word would pop up a lot: heritage. Heritage walks, heritage monument, heritage site, World Heritage Site, UNESCO, heritage festivals. But in all likelihood, you would completely miss the village that exists around it. It's not your fault because it's been pushed out of sight. This is the ancient urban village of Mayrina. It's a settlement that predates the city of Delhi itself. It holds thousands of families, and it's a complex village with caste geographies, segregated neighborhoods, and crumbling infrastructure. Shunned and bulldozed. This is the reality of Delhi. Two cities coexist parasitically. Today, the national capital is an economic and political powerhouse, but it's also a deeply segregated city with structural inequalities. And yet, monuments like the Qutub Minar itself are portrayed as entirely idyllic spaces, removed from their context. No people in the photographs, serene landscapes, clear skies, and the building front and center. For far too long have architects remained focused only on architectural objects. For far too long have conservationists ignored context and prioritized monuments. What even is a monument but a pile of stones that we imbued with meaning? Conservation here becomes an agent of elite development, spatial cleansing, and social exclusion. It is often a way to maintain power over place, and it is done in the name of heritage. This project examines the impacts of architectural conservation in Mehta because the way in which planning frameworks operate over here reveals underlying conflicts. The appropriation of heritage becomes a tool to develop destinations by displacing communities and reiterating colonial era identity politics. Heritage is often power, and the notion of heritage itself is so infused in conservation as a practice, which isn't really a natural condition, but a result of historical processes. So this is what separates heritage from history. History is an academic chronology of events, but heritage often relies on what Roland Barthes calls myth-making. It is done by institutions to depict the past in the manner they themselves see fit. In the words of David Lowenthal, heritage is a product of human creativity. As claimed by F.J. Schouten, heritage is history processed through mythology, ideology, nationalism, local pride, romantic ideas, or mostly just plain marketing. Any process of conservation involves subjectivities, despite being completely rendered technical by the agencies. This project was the result of a year-long research project, which was sponsored by grants from the GST, the South Asia Institute, and the Joint Center for Housing Studies. My research was enriched by the stories that I heard, the people that I met, and the places that I visited. In this presentation, I shall first reveal the events that led to this present-day reality. I shall use this to analyze the construction of heritage itself through the lens of critical conservation, which was my area of at the GSD. And finally, I shall lay out my own arguments towards a new mode of conservation. So how did Mehrauli get here? To understand this, it is vital to situate conservation within inherited imperialist legacies of power and knowledge. For this, I utilize the theories of Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, and Bruno Latour. So basically, in the 18th century, upper-class Europe was gripped by enlightenment. Guided by a spirit of exploration, many artists undertook the voyage to the newly colonized Orient. Two of whom were Thomas and William Daniels. In 1789, they depicted the Qutub Minar as a mysterious artifact, drawing the curiosity of patrons back home. The paintings consisted of ruins, elephants, camels, and turbaned dark-skinned men, compiled in a book they called Oriental Sceneries. Many more European painters followed. What is heritage if not exotica? After the crown took over in 1857, these depictions at once changed. From gloomy panoramas, the scenes transformed into manicured, militarized visuals. And the Qutub Minar began to draw the attention of English nobility. Look at the 16th century Mughal building, for instance. What was built as a somber tomb was refurbished and appropriated as a guest house. It was renamed Dilkush, which means heart's delight, a tranquil site for regal hedonism in the bourgeois imagination. Soon, the British epigraphical and trigonometric surveys were sent to measure the site, the beginnings of what James Scott terms the legibility project. In 1828, for instance, Robert Smith, an engineer, repaired the Qutub Minar's facade. Curiously, he decided to add a cupola atop the minaret flanked by Gothic balustrades. The result caused an uproar amongst Oxbridge preservationists, who were influenced by people like John Ruskin. They claimed that the structure's authenticity had been violated. Speaking of authenticity, the pavilion on the right is that very cupola that was installed on top. It was constructed to make its look medieval Indian looking. It was promptly taken down, of course, and termed Smith's Folly. Orientalist scholars claimed that the subjects were incapable of looking after their own old buildings and therefore needed British intervention. The second and the most important phase of conservation began in 1861 with the formation of the Archaeological Survey of India by Sir Alexander Cunningham. This project, in the words of Indra Sen Gupta, was based on the idea that colonizers had the divinely ordained duty to save relics from locals who did not understand their true value. Preservation laws were linked to the Land Acquisition Act and were framed by archaeologists such as John Marshall and James Ferguson. It is this colonial legacy that is deeply rooted and embedded in the ASI till today that still subconsciously determines its own bureaucratic handlings and conservation proposals. Despite being a mosque for 600 years, prayers at the Qutub Minar were prohibited, mainly to prevent locals from entering the site. Then again, conservation was always about territorial control. Soon, the marketability of the site was realized. By 1910, the Mehrauli had completely changed. Berms and benches were laid out, lots of landscape design, roads leading were blocked, flowers replaced the fields, British travelers replaced Indian farmers, and the monument, once a space for prayer and community, became a park for picnics. But this expropriation tells you only a part of the story. The real damage was done by Orientalist historians who used the monument to sow the seeds of religious discord, divide and rule. Drawings commissioned by the Royal Institute of British Architects in 1820 for the London Library detailed elements from the very same face of columns in the Qutub Minar complex, yet categorized them as Hindu and Mohammedan. In 1862, for instance, Alexander Cunningham wrote that Hindu elements on the site were relics of a native India, while the mosque was foreign, alien, and a deliberate appropriation of traditional architecture. Alexander Cunningham claimed that the Qutub Minar stood on the ruins of 27 Hindu temples. This popularized the idea of one victim populace and one invading populace, disregarding centuries of syncretic confluence, shared space, music, food, and language. Similarly, in 1871, when Henry Hardy Cole used plaster cast from the Qutub Minar complex, he used religion to describe architectural styles. He showcased what he called Hindu and Islamic objects at the South Kensington Museum as representing two diverse styles from two different cultures, hence the term Indo-Islamic. The Indian post-colonial epoch has been widely analyzed. Independence from British rule in 1947 was followed by the violent partition of India and Pakistan. Delhi was faced with the task of rehabilitating thousands of refugees. Mehrauli itself witnessed the exodus of many Muslim families and the influx of lower caste Hindu groups. Homi Bhabha describes how the vacuum left behind by imperialists was swiftly filled by those with what Bourdieu terms cultural capital. For newly independent India, the primary objective was of nation building. Benedict Anderson theorizes that nationalism offers collective immortality in the face of individual mortality. Monuments began to be portrayed as relics of a rich pre-colonial past. But simultaneously, according to the amended Conservation Acts of 1858, Qutub Minar continued to be off limits for prayers and quickly became a secularized, museumized object. But my project isn't just about the post-colonial. In my view, there is another emergent India. And this is the age of the post-colonial. India entered the 1990s with three pivotal events occurring in very quick succession. 1991, liberalization. Domestic markets were opened up to neoliberal capital, foreign direct investment, more trade, but also more inequality. In its wake came the push for tourism. The ever-expanding Indian middle class became vociferous in its aspiration for world-class cities. Then, in 1992, political nationalist mobs demolished the 16th century Mughal mosque, claiming it was built upon an ancient Hindu temple. This completely shifted the way Islamic monuments were treated in India. No more were they just vestiges from the past, but symbols of nationalist and cultural identity. In 1993, more specific to my own case study, the Qutub Minar was declared a World Heritage Site by UNESCO, expanding the ambit of European conservation and paving the way for agencies like the World Monument Fund and the Aga Khan Trust. This signals the renewal of European interest in the heritage of the global South. The impacts on the Qutub Minar are striking. Pop culture continues to portray it just the way the Daniels painters, the brothers once did. Bollywood films continue to show the monument as a scenery for romance. Walking tours talk of nostalgia. Music concerts occur at the Qutub Minar, where tourists revel to folk music. In the words of Michael Hadrock, there is a nervousness about making a good impression on visitors by keeping a space deliberately Oriental looking. Orientalism, alas, has come full circle. In 2017, the Adopt a Heritage scheme effectively handed over the site to private corporations. While the deal is still under review, it is worth noting that Yatra.com, a $5 billion valued tourism website, proposed to purchase the rights to fund its conservation and advertise all around it. The Qutub Minar also featured in the 2019 list of iconic sites, a $15 million project for urban tourist infrastructure. To promote, among other things, night tourism. Look at this picture. It looks really great, but $525,000 was spent on just lighting. Grade C monuments in the vicinity have been purchased by real estate developers under the garb of restoration, converted into bars, cafes, hotels, and chic boutiques that have mushroomed around the Qutub Minar. transforming heritage into a marketable backdrop for elite lifestyle. As Asher Gertner writes, this is the rule by aesthetics. So what happened to the village around it? Individual rights are instantly illegalized simply because they happen to live near a monument in so-called informal settlements, slums. This is the process of what Michael Hertzfeld calls spatial cleansing. In 2018, the Delhi government decided to remove all encroachments in and around Mehrauli. They declared that Mehrauli is to be protected from encroachers because monuments were in a pitiful state of crumbling glory. Does this not remind you of the 19th century British conservationists who claimed that locals were incapable of looking after monuments? Despite repeated appeals, residents' right to the city is violated and voided in the name of development. This has created two Mehraulis. One that is visible, cleansed, conserved, and another that is plagued by infrastructural crisis. Conservation, alas, is a ruse to commodify architecture for consumption. Just the way imperial era laws protected the building from the people, conservation authorities control development in Mehrauli. In 2010, the amended Preservation Act demarcated 100-meter buffer zones around listed monuments like the Qutub Minar, where all construction is prohibited, and an additional 200 meters that requires permits for any kind of renovation or construction. In Mehrauli, there are 20 ASI listed monuments, 14 state listed monuments, and 180 city listed monuments. By that logic, all the houses in the highlighted zone are technically illegalized and at severe risk of eviction or demolition. In 2018, the Delhi government announced plans to give legal authorization to all informal colonies. It was a great move, but the only ones missing from the list were houses around monuments. Even more interesting over here is the rise of majoritarian nationalism. Remember the claim that was made by Alexander Cunningham that the Qutub stands on the ruins of 27 Hindu temples? Today, this claim is not limited to speeches by politicians or ideologues. It can also be seen in the description on the official UNESCO website. In the ICOMOS description, as well as in the British Library archives. In 2002, political groups protested outside the Qutub Minar to reinstate Hindu idols within the defunct mosque. Not our heritage, they claim. A few parties have even gone a step further to say that the Qutub Minar is actually not even an Islamic building, but an ancient pillar dedicated to Hindu gods. Today, there are YouTube channels, Facebook pages, blogs dedicated to these stories, each with thousands of followers. Right or wrong, we don't know. But mass media becomes an efficient tool to spread information, particularly such information, which when repeated ad nauseum becomes a substitute for empirical fact or academic research. Much like the manner in which heritage supplants history in contemporary consciousness. But this is also a turf war. Literally, Islamic monuments in Mehrauli, which are not on the ASI list, are being taken over by the local Muslim communities and being reinstated as mosques. Our heritage, they claim. Is there no end to the cycle? In this web of power, what happens to this person I met? A mother of 4 whose family has lived here for 3 generations, who acquired all the municipal permits to sell tea just to make ends meet, whose kiosk was demolished simply because it looks blighted. What about this house that I visited? A family of 5 where the primary wage earner is an economic migrant, whose claim to the property is instantly illegalized because they live too close to the monument. This is not limited to the Qutub Minar. This is not even limited to the third world or the global south. This is an international story. Whether it is the preservation of Paris that separates the city from the banlieues, so there's a preserved Paris and an otherized Paris, or the spatial cleansing around the Taj Mahal, where the city of Agra is made completely different from the tourist circuit, or the whitewashing of history in Los Angeles, where there was indigenous land and no and documentation about it has been erased from popular imagination, or even the museumization of Rome. Similarly, Manhattan, a city where one of every 125 people is homeless. Manhattan is one of the most preserved places. It is clear that conservation restricts the right to the city. In a globalized world, we continue to be trapped in parochial class divides and social constructs. Conservation in its current mode freezes time and space. It is a method by which the mythical imaginations of an era long past are shielded from the exigencies of an ever enlarging present. And this is what I term the performativity of heritage. The monument ceases to remain a mere object, but instead takes on the performative role molded by the gaze of the agent. In the words of D.W. Meinig, it's the knowledge that the viewer brings that determines meaning and value. Therefore, my case study demonstrated 4 ways of looking at heritage itself: the Orientalist gaze that ascribed exotic value, the conservationist gaze that uses legal frameworks to protect buildings at any and every cost, the neoliberal gaze that treats monuments as a backdrop for elite development, challenging systems of land rights and local governance, and the political gaze that furthers often exclusionary agendas for nationalism. Each of these gazes are operationalized by certain agents, and each of them can be inverted to reveal underlying contradictions. These affect people. It is crucial to deconstruct the very notion of conservation and heritage as practiced today. To this end, I ask 3 questions. Firstly, can conservation address the changing politics of place? Secondly, can conservation ensure more equitable access? And finally, can conservation be decolonized to cultivate context-sensitive plans? And this is my manifesto for change, for a new mode of conservation, for academic research that looks beyond the monument, beyond objects, and starts looking at people and the context, and that dismisses one-size-fits-all laws. One by which institutions can reclaim the political will to ensure access to resources for all strata of society. For a community like Mehrauli, this can take the form of local area plans, neighborhood development strategies, incentives for locally owned businesses within the tourist zone. The stakeholder system can further be pivoted, for example, to develop microcredit facilities, mixed-use typologies, public and private partnerships, civic infrastructure, access for all. And most importantly, by cultivating a collectivized spirit of pluralism and acceptance. In the age of neoliberalism and majoritarian nationalism, until we as scholars, architects, even consumers do not reconcile with our own agency, our own complicity, and our own accountability, no change can happen. We need to move beyond the binaries of formal, informal, old, new, us, and them to assist people in becoming informed makers of space themselves, in their own names, in everyone's names, and not just in the name of heritage. Thank you.
Thank you, Karan, for sharing your fascinating thesis with us that makes a case for contextually relevant conservation that is relevant to a new and emerging India and its people. Thank you so much. I would like to request Angela to now please share her presentation. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Mayrina, and I'm excited to be here today and to be able to share with you my thesis research. But before we begin, I would like to thank Varna, the Design United team, and Clay Workspace for the wonderful initiative and the opportunity, and also to the moderators who will be facilitating the conversation later. To begin, my recent thesis research looked at the implications of the moving of Indonesia's capital city. Indonesia is an archipelago of 17,000 islands that were once made of separate kingdoms and scattered settlements. The history of the islands and their political recognition is linked to colonial past and practices of extraction. With its center in Jakarta, the Dutch ruled over the archipelago by extracting resources from the other islands and continued to improve Java. Years after its independence, the colonial legacy has continuously influenced the way the nation looks at its people, nature, resources, as well as the interactions between its islands. Colonial perspectives and laws were passed down, adapted, and continued to govern its inhabitants through national planning, initiatives, and policies. Today, the history and legacy of past forces are still visible, especially in the government's decision to move the capital city from Jakarta in Java Island to East Kalimantan in Borneo Island. In August last year, the president announced a plan to move its administrative capital that will take place in 2024. In the grand narrative of the capital city moving, there seems to be a lot of research done on how the move will potentially alleviate some of the burden of Jakarta and Java. As the center of the government, Jakarta is overpopulated, highly polluted, and sinking. The recent news mentioned that if nothing is done to help Jakarta, most of the city will be underwater by 2050. Besides that, there has been a lot of concern to also decentralize the power of Java. In Indonesia, the center of all state and nation building is centralized on the island of Java that has power over all the money, politics, and economic activities. The rest of the archipelago is often considered as the other islands, where resources are taken and sold and the money is brought back to Jakarta and Java. The economic discrepancy and uneven political power between Java and the other islands have been the reasons for riots and separatist movements in the ranges of the country. Therefore, there has been a lot of concern and efforts to decentralize the power of Java. Interestingly, none of the proposal for the new capital talks about the impact of the move to the current social and environmental ecosystem in the East Kalimantan. The island is merely discussed, and mostly in terms of potential, as an empty faraway land and a perfect location for the nation's new capital, but of whose visions? As a response to this view, my project seeks to create an alternative archive of the land by taking a different approach and focus on Kalimantan itself. The project is called the Guidebook of an Empty Land, which is an ongoing research project that seeks to de-empty the land with stories of its inhabitants to challenge the common portrayals of the island as empty. In the book, I structured the book as follows. On the left side of this table of content, it shows the main topic that I will cover, starting with the discussion of the empty land throughout the history and how it had led to the portrayal of Kalimantan, and then to the new capital, the reason for the move, the planning, and how the portrayal of Kalimantan as empty has influenced the way the new capital is proposed. And then finally into the discussion about Kalimantan, where I talk about the different materials, inhabitants, and substances that made Kalimantan. Starting with its soil, timber, and eventually Daya, one of the indigenous group of Kalimantan that has been continuously marginalized. Eventually, my research shows how the colonial perspective has affected the way Indonesians and the government look at the land, its resources, and its people. In order to challenge the narrative, I intend to weave the stories, memories, and history of its inhabitants that keeps on interrupting the flow of the book, so that their stories will not be forgotten. This will take through different forms of insertions, such as archives, illustrations, maps, as well as stories of my visits to the island, where I collected stories from the locals. I begin the book by talking about the idea of an empty land. The empty portrayals of land were common during the colonial era, where imperialism encouraged European explorers to go to remote parts of the earth to map the world. In these explorations, cartography became a symbol and an instrument of colonial control. Often, the new land is called terra incognita, which means unknown land or land without records. Sometimes they are called terra nullius, which means land that belongs to no one. The term terra nullius is often discussed with regards to James Cook's description of Australia when he first arrived there. In his report to the British Empire, Cook said that the continent was in a pure state of nature with not 1 inch of cultivated land in the whole country. However, in this view, the Western idea of cultivation becomes the benchmark for classifying the land. Despite the presence of the Aborigines, everything Cook found was regarded as natural or uncultivated. Thus, the land became empty or vacant. Later, Cook informed the British Parliament that since the Aborigines did not manage the land, they had no legal rights to it. This methods enabled the land to be claimed and made to conform to English laws. In colonial discourse, the emptying of the land is a way of depoliticizing territories, allowing discoverers to make claims over the indigenous lands. Beyond a way to delineate political control, the emptying of the land is also a cultural project that rejects the native cultural practices on the land. And with this erasure of natives' histories and ancestral knowledge, The land has no prior memories, history, or civilization until the Europeans set their foot on the territories. The same idea is also applied to Indonesia by the Dutch. During the colonial era, Indonesia is known mostly through touristic guidebooks. Guidebooks were made to give general information on how one should travel the colonized land, usually summarizing the people, the kingdoms, clothings, temples, rituals, and also its scenic landscape. These guidebooks mainly focus on showing the romanticized and idealized version of the Dutch East Indies to promote colonialism, covering up the 100 years of environmental abuses that have been brought upon the islands. Perceived by the readers to be authentic, the guidebooks were predetermined to show an asymmetrical relation between the visitors, who were all Europeans, and the East Indies natives, but also between Java and the other islands, including Borneo. As the colonial image and profit become the primary purpose of tourism, Java was the island best qualified as a tourist destination. The island has been under the colony longer than the rest of the archipelago. It has created a sense of security with the larger European settlements, as well as better facilitated with its expensive railways. In the meantime, the travel routes to Kalimantan would only take you along the coast and don't really go to the middle part of the island. The interior of Borneo remains untouched, empty, and undiscoverable, as it was much explored rather late at the end of the 19th century, compared to Java that was colonized 200 years earlier. This brings a different way of portraying both islands. While Java is often advertised as a wonderland, Borneo is often portrayed as the island of the pagan tribes. The portrayal contributes to the stereotypes of Java compared to Borneo and the idea of the empty land, which greatly affect the inhabitants of the island. Seen in a larger context, the guidebook, through its words, maps, and images, is a political tool of control that laid the foundation on how the world portrays Kalimantan through the colonial eyes. Used in colonial tourism, the guidebook mass-produced the image of empty land and thus depoliticized the island's natural resources and inhabitants. So, challenging the format of the guidebook and cartography, this project seeks to critique how the guidebook has been used and reappropriate the form to confront the myth of the empty land. In the first chapter of the book, I talk about Jakarta and the new capital. Jakarta is a colonial capital that used to be called Batavia. The city was not meant to be built as a capital city, but instead as a super trade factory that becomes the headquarters of the Dutch trade company. For so long, the city has been mismanaged because the citizens were not given the right to have its own administration, as it will hinder the Dutch government's focus to monopolize the trade. Built on a swamp, flood has long become the problem since the colonial era. After the independence, the problem was worsened by massive population growth, waste problem, the industrialization of the peri-urban areas, development of high-rise towers, and also land subsidence. On the right, you can see a map of future Jakarta in 2050, where most of the city will be underwater. Many solutions have been proposed to solve Jakarta's flood problem. However, none of them really tackles the real issues, while merely done to prevent the severity of the flood. Some rather focus on changing the image of the city, while using the flood as a reason to mobilize big beautification projects. Due to the intricacy of the problem, the idea of the new capital therefore is seen as an answer to many problems of Jakarta, where its complexity is simplified merely as a problem of city planning. The simplification then leads to focusing the project to urgently relieve Jakarta's burden. This allows the government to simply decide on Kalimantan, which is the largest island in the country, as the location of the new capital and move forward with the project. The idea is not new, as Indonesia's first president also envisioned moving the capital city to central Kalimantan in the 60s. The project was also seen as a way for Kalimantan to catch up with other more developed regions. Since then, the plan has been on and off throughout the history. And this time, the city of Jakarta moved the project forward, with only 5 years' time allowance for planning. At the same time, the project grows as a way to change the national image. The vast amount of land in Kalimantan allows the government to realize its dream of designing its own capital city away from its colonial past. The new capital will allow Indonesia to also catch up with other global megacities. It is then focused on being monumental and different, a gift to the world. In the planning, Kalimantan was chosen as many of the lands are owned by the government. The government said that the land is mainly an area of industrial forest complex that are parceled and leased to different enterprises, such as plantations, logging, and mining, under several years of contract agreement referred to as concessions. Moving to this area will fasten the whole process of planning. As the land is state-owned, the government promises that it will not be affecting any settlements. In reality, however, the ownership of the land is not as simple as the government has mentioned, which is shown in this map where I intend to reveal its complexity. The red line in the map shows the full area of the new capital, which is about 3 to 4 times the size of Jakarta. The area is located near Balikpapan, one of the biggest oil industry cities in Kalimantan, while the rest is mostly known as forested region marked in green. The dark green shows an area of protected forest, while the lighter one shows an area that the government considers as an industrial forest complex. Here, even though the word forest is used, what is known to be forests are mostly logged and covered with mining concessions and also monoculture plantations such as paper pulp and also palm oil. Mapping the land has long become a controversial debate which often ends up favoring the industries. Many indigenous land and animal habitats have been taken by the government by being categorized as underutilized. In this map, I tried to bring back the different villages and animal locations in the area. As you can see, all the icons on the map. While the government argues that they will not be displacing any settlements, what they consider as settlements are only villages that are administratively being recognized and also started by the government. In real life, there are many villages that are often officially unrecognized and also unregistered. The government often used the term pembebasan lahan, or freeing up the land of these villages to make room for government projects. As the process of emptying the land is much present in the way the government plans for its new capital, the purpose of compiling this alternative archive becomes even more necessary. By understanding how the island is portrayed as an empty land, I begin to notice the disconnection between how the government and the locals view the land and its resources, which I intend to reveal in the following chapters. I don't think I will have time to discuss everything, but I will try to talk about the next 2 chapters. I started the story about Kalimantan with trying to understand its soil. The soil has made Kalimantan super rich of its natural resources, but it is also the reason why the island has long been less inhabited than the other islands in Indonesia. The coastal area that is often become the target of development is made of ecologically sensitive peat swamps. Due to the climate and geographical location, the soil of Kalimantan highly contains acidic peat, which holds a lot of carbon and makes the land poor in nutrients. Careful management is required to cultivate the peat soil as farmlands. The locals only utilize a limited amount of land for farming, which is why the government views the land as idle and uncultivated. This then allows the Kalimantan to be targets of its development and extractions. Throughout the history, it has been proven that large-scale development projects done on the island often ended up in a failure and further degraded the ecosystem. They both directly and indirectly become the cause behind Kalimantan's wildfire. The fire in Kalimantan is known to be extremely difficult to extinguish due to its peat soil. However, while putting a blind eye into the problem, the government adapted colonial transmigration program and resettled people from Java to spread the population to Kalimantan and other islands. In the policy, the government mentioned that the program was meant to fill in empty areas to support national development projects, the unity of the country, and national defense. Along with the moving of the people, the government also tried to reform agricultural methods of these targeted islands. Wet rice cultivation of Java was deemed to be more productive and sustainable than the shifting dryland cultivation that is used mostly in the other islands. In the 70s, the government enacted what is called as the Mega Rice Project, where they converted fast peat swamp forests in central Kalimantan into farmlands to grow rice. The project was intended to secure Indonesia's self-sufficiency in food production. To make it happen, they transmigrate farmers from Java to cultivate the wetlands of central Kalimantan. Unlike the volcanic soil in Java, some areas of the peat swamp consist of only a thin layer of nutrients on the ground, forming a sandy landscape like this. The locals call it karangas, which means the land that cannot grow rice. However, ignoring the indigenous knowledge, the Javanese farmers who had no clue and were not guided in the process applied the farming technique in the swamp by building canals and draining the soil. In the end, rice did not grow and the farmland was struck by pests. The draining of the soil also made the peat to be unstable and become prone to fire during the dry season. After the fire, the field turns into alang-alang field, or the field of Kogan grass, which would need hundreds of years to regenerate back into a forest. Easily burned, this alang-alang caused huge devastating fires in Kalimantan every year. The cycle repeats, and every time it happens, the Kogan grass field grows larger and larger. And each time, the fire further degrades the soil condition. This is a map showing the source location of the fire in 2019, which mostly came from the area that used to be the Mega Rice Project complex. Knowing the ecology of Kalimantan forest and its soil, the Dayaks of Kalimantan prefer to cultivate their rice on dry ladang fields in the highland forest of Borneo. The method allows the farmer to ensure that little harm is done to the environment while making optimal use of its limitations. Their methods are usually known as shifting cultivation, something that the government considers as disorderly. With this method, Dayak farmers can really pay attention to the sign and cycle of nature that are embedded in their complex rituals. When a field is cleared from the forest, they make sure that the tall trees surrounding the field are intact to keep hold of the nutrients of the soil. To adapt to Kalimantan soil, they also plant multiple crops and fruit trees along with the rice. The field is usually maintained for 1 or 2 seasons before being left for a new field to retain its nutrients. When abandoned, fruit trees take over the field and eventually become parts of forest regeneration. After 7 to 15 years, the farmers would go back and reform their old field. The pattern of their field on the landscape creates a continuous cycle of leaving and also returning, which does not continuously require deforestation. This view is, however, disregarded as it hinders the government's intention to maximize the land's production. In the next chapter, I talk about how the imagination of Kalimantan's forest SMT coincides with the discovery of the island for commercial logging. The reclassifications of forests parallels German scientific forestry methods that have spread globally during the 18th and 19th century. At the time, the Dutch government hired German forestry experts and posted them in the forests of Java. After being considered underutilized, the government reclassified the forest into new sets of categories, filling the empty areas of forests with new functions in order to maximize the production of the forest. To the government, Kalimantan's forest is mostly valuable for its timber. This map shows the 2 maps of the same area. One on the left is one done by the government, and one on the right is done by the Dayak Marathas in Kalimantan. In their understanding of the forest, the government's map failed to understand the complexity of the forest and its meaning to the people who inhabit it. This view undermines Dayak's view of the forest, where all its parts are highly intertwined in the complex link of multi-species relationships. Different Dayak folk stories about the beginning of the world show their connection to the forest. For example, in the story about the Dayaks of Kayak Muntarang, where the Dayaks believe that different species such as birds, fishes, beasts, and also humans were all born from a tree that grew out of a wood plank that fell from heaven. They were all born out of the same beginning. In this view, nature and forests are an extension of one's body. It is clearly seen in many of the Dayaks' practices. For example, in this relationship between the Dayaks, Magaris tree, and the giant honeybee. The Dayaks believe that one can only claim nature if they take care of them. In the process of honey production, for example, the Dayaks could harvest honey only when they clean the trees from vines and underbrush. This act thus encourages the bee to make their nest on the tree and make them revisit the site every year. Even though the Dayaks are harvesting the honey, they do not harm the trees nor the bees, and instead help to connect the 2 entities. The bees present in the tree is important to help pollinate the surrounding trees and also protect their seeds from other animals. The importance of these multi-species connections, however, are diminished in many of the government incentives. In the way the forestry department documents Kalimantan forests, An area of Kalimantan's forest is understood mostly in terms of volumes of timber. This table, for example, mainly focuses on listing the plants that are valuable as commercial timber, while the other things that make up the forest are lumped into category of other species, troublesome plants, or waste. In the simplistic view of the government, the troublesome plants, species, and people that used to roam the area that hinders the government's optimization of forest production. Plants become weeds, animals become pests, and forest dwellers become illegal squatters. They then also become targets of the next targets of management. Therefore, the stories of Dayak, along with the other inhabitants of Kalimantan, become a way for me to talk about the different policies and government incentives that affect their livelihood, and also to challenge the narrative of the empty land. Kalimantan is not an empty land, and its history and inhabitants should be considered and included in the conversation of the moving capital. Many stories about the land are to be told, and thus this project will remain an ongoing endeavor that may never be finished. Thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you so much, Angela, for your introspective and very sensitive thesis, which is the narrative of the land through its ecology and through the history of its people. Thank you so much, both Angela and Karan, for sharing your wonderful presentations. With this, we would like to open the session to conversation. I'm very happy to introduce and welcome our moderators for this conversation. Architect Sean Wee from Kuching, Malaysia, who recently completed his master's in architecture at the University of Dundee in Scotland. He has an architecture degree from Taylor's University in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. Our second moderator for the day is Jagan Muralidharan, who is a graduate student of the Landscape Architecture program at CEPT University, Ahmedabad. He studied in the Nilgiris at the Meghan School of Architecture. So we'd like to welcome both Sean and Jagan to Design Conversation. With this, we would like to open our session for conversation. Audience, we welcome your questions, and we would like to invite you to type your questions for our designers, Angela and Karan.
Okay, I'll start with a question for Karan, if that's all right. Your thesis covers extensive research and study on the heritage, conservation, and social aspects of Qutub Minar and New Delhi. Do you see any potential in an architectural or design solution in response to the issues you uncovered during your research?
Yeah, well, thank you for your question, Sean. Yes, actually, I think the first point I want to make is that my thesis begins with addressing architecture as a more holistic field and going beyond the architectural object itself. Because for too long have architects, as I mentioned, focus on architectural objects. So the first thing would be to expand the definition of design and architecture to encompass social realities, communities, and to start looking at the people who live around these buildings, what it means for the place. And this is a strand that I found common to both Angela and my own projects, which is that we're both looking at projects where there is a process of design, and there's often this kind of assumption that design is seen as a plan from a bird's eye point of view. But it's only when you get into the weeds and you start looking from the eye level that you see the realities that exist. Specifically, I think when it comes to design solutions, solution is a word I was a little conflicted about whether I would use in my project altogether or not. Mostly because the word solution implies a kind of architectural hubris or an arrogance, saying that this is the right way forward and this is the only way. My whole project is about how it needs to be context sensitive, and therefore there cannot be a one size fits all. That's number one. Having said that, when it comes to Mehrauli particularly, I think there are design solutions that can be implemented, and my thesis kind of alludes to that. Obviously, this is a short 1 year study rather than a long project. And it was done in kind of incrementally, but there is a urban planning and design component that is about how that really talks about the infrastructure that exists around the sites, how whether it is the way the houses are built, whether it is the way the streets have been paved, Whether it is simple things like garbage collection or drainage, all of these things become a part of urban design and architecture. This is also architecture. Also, I would say conservation itself is also a branch of architecture. I mean, the fact that we are restoring using material to build something over and over again, trying to recreate something that was done literally 1,000 years back, is a very deliberate architectural practice. And I think at the end of the day, we just have to ask the question, who is designing? Uh, Before we find the solution, what is the problem and who is finding the problem? And finally, who is benefiting from the solution? So,
Right, thank you.
So I have a question for Karan. So what is your take on this idea of not decolonizing the Mehroli village at all, and can somehow we make that entire Mehroli into this into a part of active or participatory, and try include them into the elite growth that could happen around the monument?
thanks, Jagan. So in my project, in my presentation, I did not say that the village should be decolonized. I mean, literally, obviously, India has been decolonized physically because, well, yeah. But what I was really referring to was the decolonization of both practice and of theory. And by that, I mean that there is a particular kind of colonial mindset and a particular kind of subconscious attitude that has permeated through the years, particularly in post-colonial India, and continues to filter down in many different ways in post-colonial India, which is what I was talking about. Whether it is through the way the ASI works bureaucratically, whether it is the way the government treats its own citizens as somehow second class, whether it is through nationalism or whether it is through literally illegalizing certain people who live in the city as squatters or encroachers, which is also a kind of a colonial attitude. And throughout my project, I was trying to show that there are these parallels between what is existing right now, what is happening in terms of policy and act, almost mirrors the way the British had operated in the 19th century. And that shows the decolonization. So I think to that end, I would not put this as a binary. I think these are interlinked manifestations of the same problem, which is that in order to decolonize policy, law, and mentality, society at large, one would have to start addressing the community and things that are happening on the ground, which means local area plans, which means community development, which means people given exercising democratic rights, which means people being given affordable housing, fair housing, and not being illegalized just because they don't fit into a particular strata of society, or because they just happen to live near a monument. If you think about it, the people who live around these places and who are often termed slums or blighted or undeveloped, these are all colonial terms that we have kind of accepted, and we have accepted these as our only reality. But the truth is that this is a process that has been made to sound technical. It is actually a very subjective process, and it is led by agents. So yes, it is about ultimately the right to the city and about community and the people who live over there.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I have a question for Angela now. You've mentioned how your book is an ongoing project and how you've also voiced your concern about how it's an endeavor that may never be fully finished. In your mind, what would be the ideal ending to this story of Kalimantan?
So when a lot of the stories that I collected, it's mostly it's not it will never encompass the whole Kalimantan as an island, because the island is super huge. It's one of like the largest, I think maybe the second largest rainforest span in the world. And when I began this research, I was born and grew up in Jakarta. And so like talking about Kalimantan itself, I'm coming from an outsider's view. And this project I started a year ago, where I begin to try to understand what does it mean to be Indonesian, and also what does it mean for me to kind of like try to understand what is going on in Kalimantan. And so like when I begin to try to understand it, I tried to visit the island twice in the area of the new capital, where it's the East Kalimantan area and also Central Kalimantan, that used to be proposed as the new capital back in the 60s by our first president. And a lot of the stories I've collected are mostly from that area. And when I say that this is an ongoing research project, I intend to kind of like continue this project and also maybe engage with multiple people and communities who live there, and kind of like provide and also facilitate space for them to kind of speak up against kind of like all this like policies and incentives that are like they're governing their kind of their lives, but they kind of don't have the power to kind of speak against or kind of like tell their own stories, because most of the time they're always disregarded. So I think this is kind of the start where the complexities, I think, is more than what I just said or I just presented. It's more, and like definitely I wish I could kind of like expand more and kind of like include more conversation and include more people in the conversation.
Okay, thank you.
So I have a question to Karan. So how do you see neoliberal capitalism in such a context? Do you think it can help the people of Mehroli, who's really going to affected with this development of Kutub complex because of this apathy and negligence in the context? Or do you do you think finding a common ground for the people of Megroli could help improving their lifestyle and accommodate tourist movements? Or what do you propose, the one or the other?
I would say the question is, again, you're hinting at a much larger superstructure, which is a political economy question, and I wish I were qualified to answer that. But which is about capitalism at large. I don't know about that, but it is a reality that we live in. That we are as a country, as urban centers, we are very aspirational. We want certain resources and we want a particular kind of lifestyle. The only trouble becomes when certain places become backdrops for lifestyles at the expense of other people. That is where the story becomes complex. This is what I was trying to basically show Merori. I mean, that is the point of the case study. So, yes, the middle ground is absolutely right. That is what needs to be found, which is that one cannot do away with tourism in India. It is obvious we have a lot of cultural resources, we have monuments. This is true for every city. Even when I was talking about Paris or New York or Berlin or Los Angeles, this is reality. We live in a globalized world, and there will always be a tourist economy. It brings in a lot of money. It's just that the way the money is allocated, the way it is distributed, it does not reach the community that literally lives over there, and it goes to other uh, people who might use it to a particular end. So that is why when I was mentioning towards the end of the presentation that it could be done through more public-private partnerships. I know that the government has been trying to launch a number of schemes to that end. I know there are a lot of NGOs, a lot of advocacy groups that are campaigning for this. But the truth is that until the voices of the people who live there are not heard through community discussions, through local area plans, and until they don't receive economic incentives themselves or microcredit facilities to incentivize local businesses, it could be something really small. I suppose it is an incremental thing and it cannot be done overnight. But I mean, you could start with something really small, like having people become fiscal stakeholders in the system. For example, the people who live over there. It could become where businesses, for example, in Mehroli, traditional businesses are shutting down because there are all these bars and cafes that are taking over the space, and there are roads being constructed, and there is this entire landscape that has developed on the street, which completely makes these places invisible. So It is a combination of both economic policy, planning, as well as design. Maybe these people can have their own businesses in the tourist zone. Maybe that's a starting point. Uh, why not? I mean, all these hotels and bars that are coming up, why not employ local people? Why not give them also a chance to have their own places set up over there? It could be for everybody, not just the fancy bars and the boutiques that I was showing in my pictures, which is kind of what Mehrauli has become today. So it could be even mixed use typologies, which is something that we studied through architecture school, where and traditionally Indian cities and a lot of cities in the global south are based on this kind of mixed use typology, where there is a commercial zone at the bottom and the residential zone on top. So we have all of these plans, but the plans are just superimposed on existing geographies, and we assume that nothing exists over there. This is also something that I saw in Angela's presentation, that we are made to seem like there is nothing exists on the land because we're always looking at it from the sky. So
Yeah.
I hope that answers your question. It's kind of convoluted, but
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. I have an audience question from Geeta to both Karan and Angela. In each of your projects, you discuss a certain visuality and vocabulary that politicizes the places of your studies. What was the journey of decolonizing your minds or struggles? Or have they been decolonized at all? What will you do next?
Maybe I can start. So when I started this project, even the idea of forest itself is already something that has been like politicized, the word, and also like has many colonial roots in it. When I started, I also internalized kind of this idea of Kalimantan being empty. I did not know anything about Kalimantan. All I know is like that it's filled with forests. It has a lot of orangutans, and the Dayak tribes live there. But that was basically it. But when I started discovering like there are different types of forests, and even forests in Kalimantan are not as natural as it sounds or it looks like from the map. And many of the patches of the forests are mostly now patches because of the industry that keep on coming in, all the monoculture plantations. Even the government kind of have their own idea of what an ideal forest is. Monoculture plantation kind of becomes the way the government kind of navigate of like having greens, but also continue making profits from the industry. And when I started this, I'm doing this research, it's kind of like I have to kind of keep on questioning. Oh, what does it mean by this word? What does it mean by forest? What does it mean by fertile lands? What does it mean by what is it empty? Why is it empty? What kind of like what makes the construction of this kind of like imagination? Where it comes from? Who is it gonna benefit to? And I think it's right now my understanding is probably maybe still like on the surface, and I think there are more things to be decolonized. And I wish that maybe this could be like the start, and it could become like eventually kind of like a, I don't know, like a library or like a collection of like words that we kind of have to like rethink together and keep on questioning. And I think that's kind of like what is missing in design, where we are so I think focused on like making things, designing, changing things, and we sometimes have no time to kind of like question all the understanding that we understand, all the knowledge that we get. And also design practice is very it does not include a lot of like knowledges that have been our cultural practices, kind of like the indigenous knowledge of the Dayak, for example. But how can we include all this kind of like different types of knowledges into our practice is kind of like our challenge for the future.
I would, I think that's like really well articulated by Angela. And just to pick up from where she left off, I think uh, what I was really trying to show was that we assume certain things to be natural, we assume certain things to be obvious, and we assume that there are words like that we just use in everyday life. I mean, even through architecture school, a lot of times we would use the word slum. We don't know where that word came from, or who is a slum, or who is illegal, what is encroachment. Um, uh, or even what is a monument, what is heritage, all of these things. I mean, as a kid, I think as kids, most of us went for picnics and went to these kind of places, or we took like our friends over there and so on and so forth. But we sometimes forget to see that there are many layers to the places that we live in. That there are many contradicting realities that influence each other through multiple butterfly effects. And I think that is something that really came out to me through this project. And I mean, if you think about it, the fact that there's an architect from Delhi talking about the Qutub Minar, like that is the biggest cliche in the world. And that's precisely why I wanted to pick up this topic, that the most cliched things are often the most complex. And that was, in my way, my personal journey of decolonizing my own mind. And I don't think I'm fully decolonized as well. I think it is going to be a very long time before I start accepting things the way they are. And hopefully working on the ground.
Okay, it seems we're running out of time. I think we have to wrap it up here. But don't worry, all unaddressed audience questions will be on Instagram later to be answered. Yeah. So thank you again, everyone.
Thank you, Angela and Karan, for sharing your wonderful work. We wish you the very best. I would also like to thank our moderators, Sean and Jagan, the audience, Clayworks, as well as the DU team. For our audiences celebrating Ganesh Chaturthi wishes to all of you. Have a good evening.